Okay, if I can call this meeting to order, and can I welcome everyone to this, the second meeting of the Public Petitions Committee in 2020. The first item on our agenda today is the consideration of continued petitions. The first petition for consideration today is Petition 1319 on improving youth football in Scotland. As members will be aware, last year we agreed to take evidence on this petition from the Children and Young People's Commissioner of Scotland and the Scottish FA. At our meeting on 7th November, we heard from the Commissioner, and today I'm pleased to welcome Ian Maxwell, Chief Executive, and Alison Evans, Chief Child Wellbeing and Protection Manager from the Scottish FA. Can I invite Mr Maxwell to provide a brief opening statement before we move to questions?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And I'd like to begin by extending my thanks to the committee for the invitation here today. It's the first time that Alison and myself have had the opportunity to speak with the committee since coming into respective posts. And in particular for myself as Chief Executive, it's my first opportunity to underline my approach to the issues raised by the petition. I'd like to thank the petitioners and the committee for their hard work in this important area of football over the last 10 years. The evidence that has been heard by the committee has been very important to me in terms of how I have approached the questions raised. I want to be clear from the outset that children's wellbeing is central to our work at the Scottish Football Association. We have a dedicated team of 6 within a newly formed Wellbeing and Protection Department with strategic oversight from an independent Wellbeing and Protection Advisory Board chaired by Jackie Brock, who is Chief Exec of Children in Scotland, and some of you may know through her work commissioned by Scottish Government to review Scotland's system for safeguarding vulnerable children. In August last year, we published a new child wellbeing strategy, Getting It Right for Every Child in Scottish Football, which takes its lead directly from the Scottish Government's framework for supporting children and young people, and Alison will be able to touch more on the detail of that over the course of the morning. I mention this background not to suggest that Scottish football's journey of improvement is complete by any stretch, but to highlight the tangible process made during the span of the petition and the level of priority that this area now has within Scottish football and the Scottish FA. I am more than happy to address the long-standing concerns that the committee has had over the course of our discussions. However, I would like to state that in relation to the registration of players from age 15 playing as part of the Club Academy Scotland programme, I have established a working party with representation from all caste levels to look specifically at the registration rules in relation to 15, 16 and 17-year-olds. The first meeting will take place on the 26th of February and will question whether in 2020 the current regulation is viable or whether, with the best of intentions, it is a rarely used rule that carries negative consequences for young people and should be revisited. At this stage, I'll hand over to Alison, who can outline a bit more of the child wellbeing and protection work.
Good morning. I'd just like to start by underlining that the wellbeing and protection of children is an absolute priority for us at the Scottish FA. And since the petition was first made to this committee, a huge amount of work has been undertaken by the Scottish FA and its members in relation to child wellbeing and protection and the culture and values that we want to have within Scottish football. And this is a culture which is based upon children's human rights, in particular to protection from violence and exploitation, for the views of children and young people to be sought and have an influence on matters that affect them, as well as their best interests being at minimum a primary consideration. In October 2016, the Scottish FA Board issued a directive to all of its members setting out the minimum standards it expects to see in relation to child wellbeing and protection. And this directive covers issues such as information sharing, adopting a consistent policy framework, the appointment and training of a child wellbeing and protection officer within every club, a robust appointment and selection procedure for everyone in regulated work with children and young people, and that includes PVG membership, as well as training requirements for everyone working or volunteering with children and young people. And evidence that these standards are met is required as part of a member club's annual club licensing audit and in the specific wellbeing and protection audits that we carry out in the non-professional side of the game. And we're very clear that what this directive sets out are minimum standards for child wellbeing and protection. And the new strategy that Ian mentioned takes this work much further. It was developed in consultation with many different parts of the game and seeks to achieve transformative change in our culture within Scottish football in these areas. And it will guide our work over the next 5 years and beyond, setting out 5 strategic outcomes that we want to achieve for children and young people. around our policies and practices, in the participation of children and young people in matters that affect them, in our learning and development, our quality improvement, and in our leadership. It is a bold and an ambitious statement of our intention, and that's because we firmly believe that children and young people involved in Scottish football deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We'll just move on to questions. There will obviously be some questions on the new information you provide with us today. Can I just ask, on the working group, do you have a timescale for that to report?
Well, the first meeting, as I said, will be the 26th of February, and we'll go through that process. It's not something that will take a huge amount of time, I wouldn't imagine, but I don't have a definitive timescale for that completing. But
you would, presumably you would be keen to identify a timescale given just how long this has all been going on.
Yeah.
Because that is one of the things, obviously, I think this petition is the longest running petition in the Parliament. It's been running for 10 years, and I don't think that's simply because we like the idea of having conversations about football every so often. And we do understand that work has been undertaken by the SFA and SPFL in light of the issues raised in the petition. But given, I think, what has emerged about the magnitude of these issues, it does feel that the pace has been worryingly slow and significant issues remain about how children are protected in youth football. I wonder, do you agree there's been a reluctance to engage and recognise an issue, and to what extent of what you now are saying will match up to the level of concern that's been expressed?
I can only really talk about my experience in my time in post. I've been in post for 18 months. Obviously, as Alison said, there's a new child wellbeing strategy being launched in that period. It's very much a focus of the work that I do. Alison and the child wellbeing team report directly into myself, and obviously I'm very keen to get the meeting of the clubs arranged and get that process undergoing so that we can review the regulations, because I appreciate the concerns.
I mean, I think some folk have suggested that basically what's happened is that the football authorities have just sat out this petition in the hope that it will go away, that really there isn't much to see here. Do you think that what you're now saying is a recognition that that approach was wrong, and that there are key issues here in terms of the rights of young people that have been ignored for too long?
I think, again, I'm only going to talk about my time in post. I'm more than happy that this is reviewed. I don't want to comment on whether it's been sat out or not. I don't think that's appropriate for me. Since I've been in post, as I said, we've got a new strategy in place, and I am absolutely committed to reviewing the regulations, taking on board the concerns that the committee have got.
Will the strategy be published, and how will you ensure that young people and their families are aware of their rights and entitlements? There is an issue here, I think, about the culture of football, that even young people, families, because of how potentially life-changing it might be, potentially young people and their families are almost willingly being exploited. To what extent is this strategy going to prevent that kind of playing with people's dreams?
Strategy has been published.
Right,
that is a published document, and obviously that's available online to anybody. I think in terms of exploitation, you know, we take on board the committees and the petitions concerns. I am absolutely committed to reviewing it. I don't see exploitation within football in the context of, if you look at, everybody talks about power imbalance. Power imbalance is something that this committee's talked about a lot. I think in any sport where any coach has the opportunity to choose players in a team environment, I think there is a power imbalance in that relationship. I don't think we can get away from that, and I don't think we can change that. Our focus is on making sure that that power imbalance, or that power in the relationship between the coach and the player, is not exploited or abused. And that...
You would recognise that encouraging families to sign off contracts paying £1 a week was more than just simply the power to pick a team. It was straightforward. Well, first of all, it was breaking the law, but secondly, it was absolutely encouraging young people and their families to sign up for something that was absolutely not in their interest.
It was absolutely breaking the law. Fundamentally, it was breaking the law. And if I can give you some of my own experience of minimum wage requirements, I know that the last time Scottish FA and SPFL were at this committee, they spoke about that. I was chief executive of a Premiership club for 7 years. I was chief executive at the time when the story broke about the minimum wage and the £1 a week players. I think it was 2015, around about that time. Not long after that, the club I was at was subject to an HMRC audit. They went through every area of the business, and HMRC will come and audit businesses as they see fit. There was a focus on football clubs. They looked at all their contracts, from adults to youth players who were on professional contracts. They interrogated them to ensure that, in terms of working time, in terms of travel time to matches, all those requirements were being met. They actually verified the information that we'd given them independently with the individual players. They phoned individual players to make sure that what we were saying was correct. So there has been a huge amount of work undertaken. We are not aware of any players that are on less than minimum wage contracts, and if anybody is on a less than minimum wage contract, I would implore them to get in touch. That's why we are here, to deal with those issues. The SPFL have regulations that clubs sign off that they're minimum wage compliant. There is a section on the Scottish FA registration form that clubs confirm that they're minimum wage compliant, and if anybody is under those sort of circumstances, then they should come forward to the Scottish FA.
But the body was signing them off. Was it SFA? I mean, literally, they were signing off contracts that explicitly said you're getting paid £1 a week.
The Scottish FA don't sign off on contracts. We're a registration. Under FIFA regulations, we are concerned with registration. So our focus is the registration of that footballer valid for a number of reasons and to match FIFA criteria. The secondary issue is the contract of employment, which is between the employer, the club and the player. We don't have oversight of those contracts. That's between an employer and an employee. That's not for a football governing body.
Well, I think we can go back and look at the evidence, but what struck me was that there were those who tried to justify it. Well, it's very complicated, they might not work that many hours, blah, 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 blah. So you would say there's been a sea change in attitude. That wouldn't be acceptable.
Absolutely would not be acceptable.
Okay, thank you. Gail Ross.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. You say that there has been a huge amount of change that has happened since this petition came to us first in 2010. And Alison, yourself used the term transformative change, which is heartening to hear. But how do you work with these football clubs? Because obviously transformative change can sometimes be quite difficult to embed when you're working with so many different organisations. So do you have an appointed person at each club that you deal with, or how does that work in terms of your relationships there?
Yeah, so each club, both member club and the non-professional side of the game, is required to have a dedicated child wellbeing and protection officer, and some clubs will even have more than one person, depending on the size of the club and the number of young people that they have. So myself and my team, we work very closely with those child wellbeing and protection officers. We're always available to them to provide support on kind of particular issues, and we also meet with them formally on a quarterly basis. We have a network for child wellbeing and protection officers for our member clubs, and we come together quarterly to discuss particular issues with them, to share good practice and to spread learning in child wellbeing and protection.
And what feedback have you had from the clubs about how this change is going?
Yeah, so I think that's an ongoing dialogue that we have with our clubs, principally through our network meetings. What we are trying to, or what we want to embed as a culture whereby they understand and they take forward particular issues rather than us dictating to them what they need to require, because we believe that that's what will bring about the change in our culture. And I think you're absolutely right to highlight that this is a long kind of piece of work. It's not going to be something that's going to change overnight, but myself and particularly those child wellbeing and protection officers are absolutely committed to bringing about that change over time, and to always striving to do the best that we can, and never standing still in this area.
Can I just add to that? I think it's worth pointing out that club academies, particularly at elite level in Club Academy Scotland, which is what we're focusing on, over the last number of years, there has absolutely been a sea change in the way that they look to develop individuals as well as players. If you speak to any academy coach, the academy ethos across the country is to obviously develop good footballers, but to develop good individuals and good people. And they have done a huge amount of work. The clubs at the top level do a huge amount of off-field, for want of a better expression, development of children. They have education welfare officers that are on a full-time basis. They've got player care teams in place that make sure that the player is developing as an individual as much as he is as a footballer. That is very much the focus of any academy, and anybody that's been into an academy, I'm sure will have seen that at close hand, and I know that from my own experience, that that's absolutely the case, because they don't want, it's not about football, it's about the person, because a happy person will flourish in any environment, and that translates onto a football pitch.
So if there's an issue, I mean, how open are the academies and clubs to having dialogue with parents and guardians if there's an issue?
Well, that's an ongoing process. Parents will meet clubs 4 or 5 times a season on a general... It's effectively like a parents' night that you would have at school, probably a bit more regularly. And those conversations will be around the players' ability, the player's attitude, the player's work ethic, and that also gives the parents a chance to question the club on any questions that they've got. I know clubs have player forums that are set up that give players an opportunity to contact the club with any concerns, ask any questions they've got, and there are parents forums that do the same, that give parents the opportunity to go and engage with clubs. Clubs are absolutely aware of the importance of the player and the family dynamic that sits within that, and the more they can engage, you know, people talk about exit trials and when players leave clubs. It's very, very rare that a player will be walked into training one morning and told, we don't want you anymore. That happens over months. There is ongoing dialogue, particularly with players that the club have, you know, have concerns about their development in terms of the rest of the team or the rest of the game. It's not something that they do willy-nilly. It's not a decision that they take on a whim. There is a lot that goes into making sure the player is as good as they can be, and then even the exit strategy when it comes to the point that the player is leaving. Clubs do a huge amount to make sure that they stay in the game by, you know, making other Club Academy Scotland clubs aware that this player is going to be available, making clubs within the recreational game be available. I know that there are clubs that provide players that are leaving them with DVDs of their footage, of their clips, with GPS and scientific data to hopefully allow them to get to the next best club that they can. So it is, from a club perspective, I know from experience, it is very, very player-centred. Okay.
And we talk about, quite rightly, culture change, and you know, you said yourself, Alison, that that happens over time and sometimes can be quite difficult to achieve. Have you come across any issues that you've had to address?
In terms of the culture or our attitudes?
Just well, both. Just in terms of, as you say, the transformative change with the clubs. Not any sort of, major issues that I would identify. I think it's fair to say that there is a lot of capacity building that's needed across the game. In terms of kind of learning and development and people understanding the issues. But I haven't come across anyone who has particularly shown a resistance to having child protection measures in the game. There's that kind of basic understanding there. It's what those measures look like and how to put them into place that is typically the feature of the dialogue that we will have with clubs.
Thanks. Okay. Brian Whittle.
Thank you. Good morning, Ian. Good morning, Alison. We had the Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland in giving evidence recently, and he accepted that issues raised in his predecessor's 2015 report hadn't been completely resolved. So can I ask to start with what contact the Scottish FA has had with the Commissioner's office about the petition and indeed perhaps wider child protection matters since the new Commissioner came in 2017?
In the 18 months just over that I've been in post, the only contact we've had was after the last committee meeting, which was, I think, November. I contacted him and asked if he would like to meet, and he replied that he was aware that this opportunity for us to give evidence here was upcoming and wanted to wait until the other side of that. This week, it was either yesterday or the day before, we got another letter from the Commissioner asking us to go to a meeting that he was going to facilitate with ourselves, Scottish Government, the petitioners and him, which I'd be more than happy to do. That's the contact that we've had.
If I may add to that, on a kind of an operational level, we do have contact with the staff within the Commissioner's office in relation to issues around children's rights and drawing on their expertise in these areas. They have provided some training previously to our youth ambassadors on children's rights, and we will have a dialogue with them in relation to particular issues or to seek their advice on a particular matter.
Just checks. You've written to the Children's Commissioner specifically asking after his evidence-given session in November. I would have thought, I'm just putting it out there, that it would have been to their advantage and your advantage to get together prior to this meeting, to try and shape the way in which you would go forward. And you're telling me that they didn't want to meet prior to this meeting. Is that?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. If I could go on to the what worked in the wilder child protection matters, just some things the issues that were raised prior or have been raised over the period of time, especially around PVG checking of coaches. And I think, going back in time with this petition, there was a significant number of coaches that hadn't gone through that PVG checking. And there was an undertaking that we would address that particular situation. Perhaps give us an update on that.
That has been addressed. There's a very robust selection and recruitment process in place that clubs have to adhere to that requires that coaches are PVG checked before they start work at a club. That covers Club Academy Scotland, but that also covers our affiliated national associations. So the SYFA do not allow coaches to take up a post until they've been PVG checked. So we are confident that the PVG checking regime that we've got in place is accurate. I think, again, going back to my own experience from a club, there are roles within clubs, and you'll be aware of the disclosure bill and that they're reviewing what is defined as a regulated role within sport and within football in particular, because I remember being concerned at a club that the PVG framework that we had at the time didn't cover roles within football that we as a club thought should have been covered. A kitman, as an example, wasn't covered. A kitman could have engagement with players, but if we sent a PVG check for him to Disclosure Scotland, that would be rejected because they weren't defined as being in regulated roles. Now, that is changing. Part of the consultation that Disclosure Scotland have gone through has allowed us as football to go and present what we think are roles that should be defined, which will hopefully tighten up all those areas, and we've been very engaged in that process, and we'd be happy to engage as much as we possibly can in it, because it's absolutely right that all the individuals, all the touch points that are across a football club are covered by that. So from a coaching perspective, we are very confident that the coaches that are working within Scottish football, whether that's a recreational game or at elite professional level, are all adequately PVG checked. However, and Alison will probably want to jump in here, the PVG check is a very small part of this. It's far more to do with culture and methods and awareness and education that's going to get us to the point where we all want to be. PVG is a very small part of this process.
Okay. I agree with the last statement. That's the kind of direction of travel I was going to go in. I think we would recognise that the vast majority of coaches, volunteers, do a fantastic job. And I think what the Petitions Committee here are interested in is to ensure that there's the more unscrupulous or if I may use the term, uneducated coaches slip through the net. So can you confirm to me how those checks are done? How are you managing that process in terms of interacting with from a PVG checks perspective, especially at the amateur level? It's
an online system. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, Alison, but the IT system that the Scottish FA have covers the recreational side of the game. A coach can't be registered as a coach unless he has a PVG number. So it can't happen. The club can't. He can't be authorised to coach at a club unless he has a PVG number, which goes through the system. That's then checked, and then it's approved. So there is an automated system in place for that. That's right.
Okay. I think the thing was raised. You raised it yourself around the people at a club who perhaps have a role that interact with children and should be for part of a PVG check. It's been raised with me that intermediaries or agents perhaps don't have to go through that process. Is that correct?
That's correct. At the moment, I think that's part of the bill, that they would fall under regulated roles. Scouts are another one that should fall under regulated roles. So obviously, we'd be, as I said, we're more than happy to engage with Disclosure Scotland on who we think and where the touch points are within football that we would like to see covered off. But intermediaries will be going forward.
Yeah, that's our understanding.
Okay, thank you very much.
Corrie?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Maxwell.
Good morning.
Mrs Evans. One of the key concerns highlighted to us before is the 3-year registration period for players and how the balance of power seems to be stacked heavily in favour of the football clubs, rather than the best interests of the child. How does the SFA respond to this significant concern to us?
I highlighted at the very start that we are going to review that 3-year registration period. We note the committee's concerns. I think it's always appropriate to look at this in context. And the context in terms of Club Academy Scotland, there are just over 2,000 players in the Club Academy Scotland system. Now that's been dramatically reduced over the years because clubs want to work with a more select group of players, and it's not about hoovering up as many as they can. We have regulations in place that clubs can only have 16 players at each age group. Of those 2,000, 500 on an average. Over the last 2 years, there's been just over 1,000 have moved club. So that's either moving from a Club Academy Scotland team to the recreational game, moving from the recreational game back into Club Academy Scotland, or moving from Club Academy Scotland team to Club Academy Scotland team. So the reality is there is a huge amount of movement. That is a quarter of the players in the programme on an annual basis are moving from club to club. So the reality doesn't actually stack up that players aren't allowed to move. Players are allowed to move. There is a huge amount of movement from players. That starts with the player's relationship from the club, because the players will move for a number of reasons. The players will move because the club and the player agree that it's in everybody's best interest, that he needs to go and get more game time somewhere else if he's not getting enough game time. If parents move or relocate through work, players move. If players are unhappy, players move. All those things happen on a weekly basis, and that is down to the relationship that the clubs have with the players. So while the regulation looks like players are stuck there for a 3-year period, the reality is there is movement within Club Academy Scotland. We are not aware of any players that are being held in contracts that they can't get out of.
Can I ask, what's the break clause then within the 3-year registration if somebody wants to move? I mean, are you aware of anybody who's had a problem in trying to move and can't because they've been pinned down by the 3-year registration? What is the notice period?
Again, to talk about the reality, if a player is registered to a club and wants to move for whatever reason, he engages with the club. There are very few occasions where a parent will contact the Scottish FA and say, this situation's arisen at a club, how do we get ourselves through this process? And we will mitigate that. We have a young person wellbeing panel which have the ultimate responsibility to terminate a contract, and if a player came to us with any concerns about the way they were being treated or any other justifiable reason, then we can take action to terminate that contract. But we are not seeing instances of players that want to leave a club that are being stopped from doing so. I'm not aware of anything. Because if you look at it, you know, I touched earlier on about the work that clubs are doing, about the development of people. They want their players to be the best they can be. Unhappy people in any environment don't make good workers, good staff if you're in an employee situation, or good sports people. It doesn't make any sense.
Right, okay.
So it's in everybody's best interest that there's a resolution found if there's an issue between a player and a club, and our experience is that is what happens.
Can I ask a question then to Mrs Evans? On that basis, what Mr Maxwell was saying, are you happy having come in? How long have you been in this role?
Just over 2 years.
Right. Are you happy that the documents that a player has to sign, or the parents are aware of, the guardians to sign, or to prove it being signed, are you happy that there is clauses in there to reflect what Mr Maxwell is saying about a person can move, or they can have what you call a three-month period of notice, or a cooling off, or mediation by the SFA? Is it quite clear to the
Yeah, so we've produced...
It's in writing, presumably, what they
Yeah,
sign.
so we've produced information for children and young people and parents around all of these issues, because we recognise the complexity in understanding of those issues. And that is something that we keep under continuous review. So the information that we have available on our website currently and available to clubs, we're currently reviewing for the start of the next season to make sure this is as accessible you know, as it can be. That information, explains the formal mechanisms that are in place whereby a young person can leave a club, and ultimately that involves contacting, as Ian said, the Scottish FA. We will undertake some mediation in those circumstances, and in the handful of occasions that I'm aware of that parents have come to us, we have reached a successful conclusion, and the young person has left the club. The ultimate kind of body, as Ian said, is the young players' wellbeing panel, which would be available should a young person and their parent wish to raise that matter with the panel.
Okay, I mean, you made a lot of thing about, yes, go to the website, but some people may not be, able to do that. Is it physically written in the contract with the child, the young person, which the parents or guardians will see? Is it actually there? I mean, we hear about the hyperbole about all being on the internet. Well, that's fine. But is it physically written on the document, which is the legal document?
So we ask clubs in terms of the guide that we have, which we have tried to make as accessible as possible to young people. We ask clubs to make that available to the young person and their parents at the point that they are looking at the formal documentation. So by its very nature, the documentation is more formal than you would want for a young person, but the information that we have designed to accompany that, we hope explains in a bit more kind of friendly language to people what it is that they are signing, and that is in terms of how we communicate with children and young people. That is something that we continually keep under review, because we're aware that a lot of children and young people, providing them with written information isn't the way that they consume information. So as I say, that's a constant ongoing process for us.
Would you agree, therefore? I mean, I hear what you say again, but you're not really answering the question. I mean, if you could show me a document, for example, I mean, is it physically written there? So Mr. Smith, whose son Jim is a young player, is it physically written in that document, yes or no? That it's clear that they have a right to, notice period or whatever it is.
So there's the formal registration form that people will sign. Very happy to share a copy of that with the committee. But as I say, for me, the important thing is the information that goes alongside that formal form, which explains in clearer, hopefully more straightforward language, what the terms that are used in that formal document are.
Right. So it's not physically written in the document. Is clearly.
In a way that I would deem to be accessible to children and young people. No, it's not. It's the accompanying information that goes along with that sort of formal form, which explains that to children and young people.
So you're not happy with that then? You're not happy with the fact it's not written in the form?
I'm not making any comment on that. I'm saying the important thing is, regardless of whether it's on the form or whether it's within the accompanying information, the important thing for me is that children and young people and their parents understand what it is that they are signing, and the registration, and also importantly how to raise any issues or concerns that they have, both at the point that they are signing that, but also through the entire time that they are involved in Scottish football.
Thank you, Jim.
Can I just clarify then, you seem to be suggesting there's really nothing to see here. Why would the petitioners think there was a problem with a 3-year registration where all the power is with the club, that they can release somebody, but the young person can't go without the permission of the club? I get that there's a lot of movement, but it's fundamentally something here which the committee has been looking at, which is that a young person under 16, 15 years of age, could be held to a club for 3 years under the current rules, again, whether they want to or not. Is that acceptable?
Well, to answer the first point, I don't think anybody for 1 minute is saying that there's nothing to see here. That's absolutely not the case. And I think the fact that I've started this by saying that we take the committee's concerns on board and we are going to review the registration processes over that period.
Fundamentally, will you be looking at getting rid of the 3-year registration, which seemed, from where we're sitting, looks as if it may not be very many young people, but there'll be young people held in a club when they don't want to be there any longer and can't go and play the football somewhere else. While at the same time, the club can release somebody or get rid of somebody within the 3 years.
I'm not going to second guess what the outcome of that review is going to be.
Do you have a view? I mean, a pretty basic thing.
Well, the
Do you have a
conversation,
view
the
that it's-
conversations,
well,
sorry.
Sorry,
The
just to be
Yeah.
clear, is it your view personally that it's acceptable that a young person can be held to a registration where they've signed up when they're 13, 14, 15 years of age for 3 years when they don't want to be there anymore? Fundamentally, should that be something that could happen, even if it can only happen to one person?
If the player doesn't want to be at the club anymore, the player can leave the club. There are mechanisms by which that can happen. There are guidelines laid out by which that can occur. So no one's saying that that's not the case. The conversations I've had with clubs around this issue are the football landscape changes. The registration processes that we have at the minute have been in place for a considerable period of time. We have not actually taken a step back and said, is this registration correct, for a number of reasons? And that's what we're going to review.
No. Although it's been raised for 10 years.
I accept that. I can only talk about what I'm doing now.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I very much appreciate, and the committee very much appreciates you being here today and having very positive things to say. But is this something you can mitigate the impact of a 3-year registration? You can say, well, you can go anyway. The really fundamental question is, why is it there at all? And is that consistent with, I think, the very positive things that are being said about the rights of young people and the integrity of young people inside the system?
That's exactly the question we're asking.
Right, and I just feel to me that you can ask the question, you could probably also answer it, because it's quite basic. I mean, is the issue that it's not within your authority or grasp to make that decision? Is this something that clubs are holding on to, while the SFA is maybe more
It's not. I don't think it's necessarily something that clubs are holding on to. We're a members' organisation and have a membership that. Yeah, listen, we're a members' organisation. As I said, I've had a conversation with most of the clubs involved in CAS, and they've all said, let's review it. Do you know what? We've never actually thought about it. You might be right. Let's go and review the rule. So there is an absolute willingness and an openness to go and review it. I'm not sitting here because I want to say this and for it to go away. That is absolutely not the case. It is a genuine attempt to take on board the committee's concerns, the petitioners' concerns, and make sure that the regulations within Scottish football are fit for purpose.
And one of the fundamental things you'll be looking at is just a simple fairness in a system. You've already recognised the imbalance of power, the fairness of the registration scheme as is.
Yes.
Okay. Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. Just on that point there, there's also an imbalance of power between English clubs and Scottish clubs, and English clubs' ability to pay, much more exorbitant fees for young talent than Scottish clubs, which I think, for me, suggests why there is a resistance to try and change the registration process, this 3-year registration process. And from a business perspective, I understand that, but we're talking about child welfare here. So that must come into play from a club's perspective in terms of making that decision, or looking at this registration process and how that might affect their bottom line. Is that fair?
Well, it's FIFA regulations that govern cross-border movement of players, so that's not within the Scottish FA's gift. We can concentrate on the domestic landscape and what we have domestically in the regulations we have in place. If a player is moving from Scotland to any other country, now Brexit could have an impact on that as an example. That's what I'm saying about the football landscape changes. We don't know from a player movement perspective the impact that Brexit is going to have. But those are FIFA regulations, that's FIFA guidance, and I'm sure people will be asking FIFA exactly the same questions as we're being asked about, children's rights, and are they fundamental at the heart of those? But that's not for us to comment on, Brian.
But what I was actually getting at is the fact that, let's say, for example, there was no registration in terms of for a club. That would allow English clubs just to come in and swoop. Whereas if they're under a contract with a club, the club get compensation. So I get why there's a resistance there now, and I get why that's a difficult one for the club to work around. And that's all I'm saying, is to say, from your perspective, if you, as the chair has said here, if you took away that registration process, that would take away a potential revenue stream from Scottish clubs.
I think it depends on what the registration process looks like. And I think that's the part that's the point of the review, to understand, is there a slightly alternative registration process that addresses some of the concerns but still protects the club, because that is a vital part of a club income, and clubs are spending a huge amount of money on development of the player, not just as a player but as a person, and it is right that there's a balance between what they're, between those two elements. So I take the point. It is FIFA regulations that cover that, but I think the review has to look at the registration mechanism that does give clubs some sort of protection.
Can I, just for clarification here, so under SFA rules, football clubs can request compensation for a transfer of a child between professional clubs, even if that child is non-professional. Okay. But at a previous meeting of this committee, it was suggested that these are rules as a requirement of FIFA. That's not the case. I don't think there seems to be a bit of confusion here. So I wonder if you could explain why compensation payments are occurring if it's not in keeping with the world governing body FIFA regulations.
It is absolutely in keeping with the world governing body regulations. FIFA Article 1 in the regulations and status of transfer of players talk about domestic movement of players from club to club, and they are very clear that regulations should provide a system to reward clubs investing in the training and education of young players, and that's what it's a reimbursement of training costs that the Scottish domestic guidelines look at. To give that a bit of context as well, in the last 2 years, out of the 1,000 players that have moved, 10 players have moved and there's been reimbursement of training costs paid to their previous club. So there's 5 players a year out of the 2,000 that are in Club Academy Scotland that are actually that are moving, and that reimbursement is taking place. So again, there are hundreds of players moving between CAS clubs on an annual basis. If it was that it was all about transfer fees and all about putting a price on players, there would be far more of that. That's just not the case. We're not seeing the evidence that that's the case.
So just for clarification there, the assertion of the petitioner is wrong.
The assertion of the petitioner is accurate in terms of cross-border transfers. The FIFA regulation that they quote, I think is Article 4, talks about cross-border movement of players. FIFA Article 1 talks about the domestic landscape. I mean, I've got it here, I can read it to you if you want, but there is a requirement on us. We are mandated by FIFA to have a system in place that rewards investment in training and education of young players. I can send on that information.
Okay, I think that would be helpful. Just one more thing I thought the petitioner wanted to raise was the case of Billy Gilmore, who was subject to an illegal deal between Rangers FC and Chelsea. It's now been confirmed as a breach of FIFA regulations. Can I just ask, if FIFA rules are breached, does that mean the national rules have also been breached? And what would the SFA, what did you do to intervene in that issue? And to what extent is the Gilmore case indicative of any wider malpractice?
It's FIFA that govern those cross-border transactions. We play no part in that at all. We weren't aware of that until the FIFA effectively announced it.
Yeah, I understand. Just trying to set a landscape here. So that transfer didn't contravene SFA national guidelines. So you don't have it. You have nothing to do with that particular transfer. No. Even though it's a Scottish player.
Yeah.
Okay.
And could it happen to a Scottish player if they moved to another club within Scotland? Would it be acceptable if it happened within Scotland?
For a player movement that breaks regulations, no.
So it does apply?
Well, the fundamental of a player moving from a club to club and working under the guidelines of the domestic national association being the Scottish FA, obviously that they can't be breached, and that would apply. The case in point here is a case where a player at a Scottish club transferred to a player at an English club, and the governing body in that circumstance is FIFA. It's not the Scottish FA. That's a transfer between two national associations, so that's under FIFA's jurisdiction as opposed to ours.
No, I understand that. What I was asking was that something that was deemed to be a breach by FIFA, if the transfer had been between clubs within Scotland, would the SFA deem it the same thing to being a breach?
Yeah.
So the same thing applies?
A breach of the regulations would apply, yeah. I'm not quite sure I understand the point.
Well, your suggestion was it doesn't apply in Scotland because this particular case involved somebody moving from Scotland to England. I'm asking if the same thing happened, if the young person hadn't gone south of the border but had gone elsewhere in Scotland, would that still be a breach of your regulations? So there isn't a difference. The problem is unacceptable whether it happens within Scotland or between Scotland and England.
But I'm kind of struggling with the point that there is a fundamental, if there is a breach of regulations at any level of Scottish football, then that is a breach. What that breach is, the breach that happened in that case, I don't think can happen under domestic regulations because we don't have the same regulations because they govern cross-border.
Yes.
But if there's a breach of regulations, breach of transfer regulations, obviously we would be involved in that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to Brian in a minute, but what I'm trying to clarify is the thing that was done was deemed to be a bad thing.
Yeah.
Is it deemed to be a bad thing if it happens inside Scotland? So your regulations are consistent with FIFA regulations?
Yeah.
Okay, Brian?
I'm good.
Okay, in that case, if we can move on to David Torrance.
Morning, panel. The petitioner has highlighted that once the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child becomes part of Scots law, multi-year registrations and compensation payments for children will be unlawful. Although they say the system currently already breaches international and domestic law, how do you respond to these claims?
As part of the review, whatever the regulation changes are, they will obviously adhere to the relevant law. That just makes absolute sense. That why would we do something that contravenes that? So we've absolutely no problem making sure that the regulations are under the relevant law.
Can I ask, why have you not already done this then? The petitioner's been saying that you've already breached it. Why are you not put in place these?
Well, our position is obviously we wouldn't have regulations in place that do breach any law. So our position would be that they don't. But as part of the review into the registration process, then that will be reviewed as well.
Okay. Can I go back to minimum wage, which was mentioned earlier on? The committee has evidence that some young players haven't been receiving the minimum wage. And in your evidence earlier on, you says, can they contact you? Have any young players did that? And how often? So none of it all have?
No.
Do you not find that surprising? No young players. How often do you promote that message down through your clubs?
Well, the minimum wage is actually an SPFL. I'm not passing the buck, but the minimum wage is actually an SPFL requirement because it's the clubs have a contract of employment and the body that governs that is the SPFL. How often do we promote it? I think it's been very well promoted, you know, because of the stories that, or the revelations that were in the paper however many years ago that was. I think that's kept it in the forefront of people's minds, and I think people are aware of minimum wage legislation. Minimum wage legislation is a fairly well, worn topic, and I think players will be aware that what they're being offered has to meet those requirements. So we are not aware of anybody that's not getting it. Nobody's come forward to us. Anybody that's not getting it should absolutely come forward to us. And as I said, from my own experience, I know how hard clubs work to make sure that they are complying with all their obligations, and as far as I'm aware, that is the case. I don't have any other evidence to suggest otherwise.
As a governing body for Scottish football, do the SFA check with these clubs that they are doing it?
The clubs self-certify through the SPFL regulations. As I said at the outset, our primary function is registrations. We look at player registrations and whether the registration is valid against FIFA regulations. It's not concerned, we're not necessarily concerned with the contract of employment and the terms of those contracts of employment between the players and their employer.
But as a governing body, should you not be concerned?
It's not our function.
Is that not
we're the regulatory body for the rules of football. That's an employment matter. There's an employee-employer relationship which sits separate from that. We govern the rules and the regulations of football as opposed to the contractual element. I mean, contracts between players and clubs are very, very complicated. Obviously at higher level, they can be less than straightforward. So we ask clubs to confirm that they're complying with their legal obligations as an employer. And if anybody's in a situation where that is not being carried out, they have to let ourselves or the SPFL know.
If you're asking them to confirm there, why don't you check then?
Because it's...
Surely as a governing body, you have a right for the protection of these young people and their welfare. So why don't you check?
Because that's young people and their welfare is different. Young people are on registrations, they're not on contracts, they don't get paid. When you get to 16, 17, 18 years old and you're legally able to work, then your employer has to comply with the law of the land. And that is the law of the land that deal with employee issues. It's not for... Scottish FA are a football regulatory governing body. We govern the regulations of the game and have a wider remit for, participation, development, all those sides of it. We don't get involved in the relationship between an employee and his employer.
Should you though?
It's not what we're here for.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, so there is a pretty fundamental thing here that you're saying that you could conceive of circumstances where young people are not paid the minimum wage, clubs that you're aware of, but it's not your job to do anything about that.
The clubs are breaking the law.
So is there what consequence to them is there for you as the regulatory body of an organisation that's breaking the law?
They would breach the SPFL regulations on minimum wage compliance, and the SPFL would deal with that. We have sanctions in place if someone's found to be in breach.
But we took evidence where there was contracts being, there was registrations being, or there was work being done to confirm a contract, and the contract had within it a payment that was less than a minimum wage, and we were told, well, that's not our job. And you seem to be suggesting too that it's the job of the young person. In circumstances where we've already agreed that young people will often, in pursuit of a greater goal, will almost allow themselves to be exploited. Do you not have a duty of care to them?
The employer has a duty of care to the young person. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but there is a difference between football governance and regulation and employment law. The fundamental point here is companies, any company in the country, is under legal obligations to comply with minimum wage legislation. I don't know, there will be thousands of employment contracts signed on a daily basis that nobody actually checks are compliant with minimum wage. That's the world that we live in. Nobody checks every single employment contract that's ever signed to make sure that it's compliant with minimum wage. There is a fundamental difference between football regulations and governance, which the Scottish FA do, and the employment contract between a player, and they're not young, but well, they're 16, 17, they're of legal age.
I'm sitting there young.
They're of legal age to be employed, and that relationship is between them and their employer. If there's any breach of PAYE obligations, statutory obligations as an employer, they are breaking the law, and we don't get involved in that. That's between the club and the player. As I said, there's SPFL regulations that they ask clubs to self-certify that they are minimum wage compliant. It has been a very focused on area. We are not aware, ourselves or the SPFL, of any players who are receiving less than minimum wage, and all I can say is, if anybody is aware, please let us know and we will deal with the club, but we do not check at the point of signing the contract that that's the case.
I mean, all I can say to you is that there are quite a lot of exploitative employers kicking about. I have never really been aware of any that would get somebody to sign a contract for £1 a week. And that nobody in the system then says this has to go beyond the young person themselves making a complaint. And
that £1 a week contract was highlighted, and that has been addressed. As I said, I've gone through my own experience. I know the audit that we were subject to ensure that we were minimum wage compliant. I know that I think all the Premier League clubs at that period went through that same audit process.
Do you think it's damaging to your commitment to football and the work that's been done by SFA and by clubs who understand? Is it damaging to them that there are people willing to exploit young people and not guarantee them the minimum wage? And if you think it's damaging to your reputation...
With respect, who are these people?
Well, if you think it's damaging, do you think it's damaging to the reputation of Scottish football?
It would be damaging to the reputation of Scottish football if that was the case. Who are these people that are paying less than minimum wage? Because if someone points them out, we will deal with them. We've heard a lot that there are players being paid £1 a week.
Right.
We are not aware of any players that are being paid £1 a week or less than minimum
we
wage.
had evidence in front of us.
Yeah, historical evidence which has been addressed.
But historically, things don't change unless you no, they were there, and maybe they've changed. The question I'm asking you is, what are the protections around this? So yes, that particular incident, which I think took everybody by surprise, but the issue was that people tried to justify it on the basis that it's very complicated to try and work out whether a young person is actually playing or whether they're travelling or all the rest of it. Would it not be, in terms of the reputation of Scottish football, in the interest of the SFA to say that you do see it as part of your job to be checking what contracts have been signed? Simply from the point of view that you don't want young people to be exploited, and we've heard very positive messages about that, and that actually just to say it's for the young person himself to complain, it flies in the face of all the evidence that the power relationship doesn't really allow for that.
I don't agree. I don't agree. I think I don't want to say it again, but there is a fundamental difference between contracts of employment with any employer in the country. They break the law if they don't conform with all their obligations as an employer, whether that's holiday pay, amount of holiday time, sick pay. There are a number of obligations that employers have to meet. If they are not being met, that is a matter for the employer and the employee to deal with. From a regulation perspective, as I said, the SPFL have got regulations that they ask clubs to sign off that they are all minimum wage compliant.
But you do have ultimate responsibility for the control and development of football in Scotland. Surely that must be part of your role. I'm trying to think of any other regulatory body who may be aware that there are breaches of something pretty basic, and yes, it's their job, but if it's damaging to the reputation of your organisation and to football, given your responsibility for control and development of football, would you not see that as part of your job?
I think if there is evidence that it's being breached, it's damaging to Scottish football. There's no doubt about that, but there is no evidence of it being breached. There is historic evidence which has been addressed. There is no current evidence that says any club in Scotland is paying less than minimum wage.
Have you checked?
They all self-satisfy.
Right, so you haven't checked, so you don't know there's evidence.
Listen, I've been through that. We don't check the terms of contracts. We check the registration is valid and the contract is dated at the same time as the registration is effectively what we do.
So while you accept it's damaging to the reputation of football if it were still continuing, you haven't done anything to check whether it is still continuing?
It's not within our jurisdiction to check that.
Okay, Maurice Corrie?
Sort of following on, Mr Maxwell and Mrs Evans, and probably more for Mrs Evans, this question is in relation to the right balance being struck between clubs and the welfare of children and young people. You talked earlier on about, you know, the clubs are responsible and what SPLFA... Well, the SPLF obviously covers Premier League, but there are other clubs within underneath that, which obviously the youth will transfer. So I have a concern there as well. But in this particular case, can you let me know and tell us how youth football in Scotland should be regulated? Should it be by self-regulation, or whether there should be external regulation brought in to be necessary to solve the problems we've talked about? Because clearly through the consideration of this petition, there has been much discussion on that. So maybe Mrs Evans might like to address that. Basically, how would you see the football in Scotland being regulated, in your view, as a result of the balance between the clubs and the young people for their welfare?
I mean, I think ultimately the question of you know, self-regulation versus external regulation is clearly a matter that the committee has been considering over a number of years. You know, we've outlined our absolute commitment to the well-being and protection of children within the game, and all of the progress that we have made and are continuing to make over the kind of the coming years. And you know, if the committee would like any further information about that, or to come and and visit us, or kind of visit academies to see that kind of for yourself, we're very welcome. You're very welcome to do so, and we're happy to facilitate that for you.
So you're happy that the current system is working?
In terms of the child well-being and protection, I think we've made an awful lot of progress, and we are continuing to make really big strides in terms of this area compared to where football has been previously.
So therefore, changes could be effected through the current way it's done.
That is,
and that's being done.
Yeah, I think as we've said, this is an absolute priority for us, and we will continuing to work in that area. We have our 5-year strategy, but we're very clear that that's a kind of the first 5 years we will continue to build, thereafter in terms of this area.
Because I got concerns because Mr. Maxwell said about the SFA, they don't check, or don't obviously know who's doing what, etc. in relation to this minimum wage, which is referred to as a convener of £1, and therefore there seems to be a sort of block. It's rather left to the market to decide, and that's a concern to us.
In terms of child wellbeing and protection standards, we very much look at those, as I've said, through our annual member club licensing audits. A club cannot be a member club of the Scottish FA without meeting the minimum standards that we have set out, and we are incrementally building on those standards year on year. And in relation to the non-professional side of the game, we do specific wellbeing and protection annual audits in that area, again to look at the minimum standards and also how we can build on those.
Right. From your professional experience then, Mrs. Evans, in relation to well-being, would there be any changes you'd like to implement that you see currently that from the work you're doing? I mean, blue sky objective, you would feel, yeah, I'd love to do that, but we can't because of this or that within regulations SFA or the SPLF.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of changes that we're working on to bring in. There's nothing that we haven't proposed as yet, or nothing that I can foresee that would be prevented from being brought in terms of the regulations of the Scottish FA. Our work is in relation to the culture that we have within the game, and building on that.
Okay, thank you.
Tom?
Thank you, Gina. I think one of the things that strike me throughout this is the complicated landscape that is, the sort of football family, if you like. I mean, the regulatory bodies are yourself, the SFA, there's the SPFL, there's obviously schools football as well, and they have women's football as well. That relationship between those bodies is that somehow, being a bit of a barrier to getting to the place you want to get to with this? I think for me there seems to be a bit disjointed in terms of the the travel football. A kid coming in at the start, right the way through that, it could come through several governing bodies. How's that relationship?
I don't see that relationship has been an issue, Brian. I think fundamentally we've got the Scottish Football Association, we have affiliated national associations which are the Youth FA, the Amateur FA, so constituent parts of the game, but we govern them. And we have a relationship with them, and that's been shown by the fact that previously there was an issue with the SYFA in terms of PVG check and the practice that they have had in terms of their coaching qualifications, and that's been addressed because we've now got them between us, we've got to the place that's right for Scottish football. We have ongoing dialogue. All those affiliated national associations are part of our non-professional game board. We meet regularly over the course of a year and discuss issues that are happening, whether it's an SYFA issue, whether it's an amateur issue, whether it's a SWF issue, as you touched on. The demarcation lines are actually fairly distinct because SPFL is a competition organiser. They run the top 4 divisions in Scotland. They run the competition, and their responsibility is that. The Scottish FA are responsible for promote, foster and develop Scottish football as a whole. From the minute you can start kicking a ball to the point that you can't kick a ball any longer, and everything in between, we want to affect and we want to deal with and we want to engage with you on, and that's what we do through the affiliate national associations. I don't think the governance relationship is any more complicated. I think it's fairly straightforward. I think all the constituent parts understand what their roles are. We're aware of what those roles are. That has been a challenge over the years, going back historically, because people have been a bit disjointed, but that's not the case at the minute. As I said, we have regular meetings with the different constituent parts of the game to make sure that we're all on the same page and areas such as child wellbeing. Our child wellbeing strategy will cover the ANA's SYFA. That they all fall under that, so I don't see it being too complicated that it gives us an issue.
Okay, thank you.
Just a last couple of points before we finish, and I appreciate the amount of time that you've given us. Can I just clarify on this question of breaches, so breaches to employment law, blah, blah, blah. And even if it's not really terribly many for the young people that may be being exploited, it doesn't matter. What are the sanctions for clubs if it came to your attention that they had contracts which didn't pay the minimum wage?
That would go to the SPFL, convener. I'm not sure the detail of that. I don't know. There are sanctions in place for that. I don't know the detail.
Right.
I can find that out.
Right, okay, that would be helpful. But as a SFA, you wouldn't have a role, full stop, even if young people did come forward and there were breaches. In terms of the reputation of the SFA and your role in developing football, you wouldn't have a role in that.
Young people could come forward to us, and we would take that information and pass that on to the SPFL.
I'm saying if young people do come forward to whoever and complain, and it's established this is routine or it's happening, and they report it to you, you wouldn't have any sanctions against clubs who were doing this?
I think that, there is an overarching bringing the game into disrepute article which would be breached. But in terms of individual sanctions for that offence, that would go to the SPFL.
Right, and they would have breached their self-certification if they were doing something which was what they were signing up to say they were doing all the right things.
It's an SPFL self-certification.
Right, okay. So, and they would have breached the SFA regulations by breaking the law.
They would have broken the law by breaking the law.
But in terms of your role, even if it was established they were breaking the law, it wouldn't affect their relationship with you?
We would have an interest in any club that breaks the law, obviously. What that would look like, I'm not entirely sure.
Right, so it's not written down what happens if people break the law?
No, it is written down, I just don't know the detail off the top of my head.
It would be useful to know that. Two last points. The Commissioner has written to the Scottish Government asking whether the Scottish Government feels that self-regulation is ensuring children's rights are protected effectively, or whether the Scottish Government agrees that statutory measures are now required. What would your response to that be?
I think that's a decision for Scottish Government to take.
If the Scottish Government came to you and said, we're hearing that self-regulation is not working, what reassurances could you give them so that they don't look to statutory measures?
I think we could give them the reassurances that we've discussed this morning about the measures that we've got in place and the focus we've got on child wellbeing and protection throughout Scottish football.
And specifically, I guess, to summarise, this question of really around compensation registration. These are things that you're alive to. Can I ask in terms of, I did ask already, but it would be helpful for us to know in terms of our consideration of our report, about, you said you didn't think that the working group's work would take that long. Can you give us even a guesstimate of when you think that, an end point when you would be reporting?
Can I come back to you on it? Can I give it some thought and come back to you on it? Is that okay?
That would be extremely helpful because,
no problem.
As you will appreciate, there are folk who are saying this has just been played out, it's been run on, people are not really taking this seriously, it's getting by the day, but it would be really helpful if we knew that when that would be. And I suppose also you talked about having a meeting with the Commissioner.
Yes.
And do you see as the main focus of that meeting?
The initial request for a meeting from myself was off the back of the hearing that the Commissioner had here, and to try and discuss each other's, discuss concerns effectively. It's to open that dialogue. I've not met with him, not had any chance to discuss with him, so.
And obviously this whole issue about the implications of the human rights, United Nations rights of the child being written into law, that's going to have an impact as well. And is that something to be part of?
Absolutely.
And do you see a role for the petitioners in any of these conversations?
I would see a role for a number of different stakeholders in the conversations, but I think we just need to work through that detail, so I'll come back to you on that.
Okay, that would be very helpful, and obviously any sort of further reports in that meeting, I think we would
Yeah.
also find helpful. I mean, in terms of what we need to do next, obviously we need to reflect on the evidence. We will be working in private on a revised draft of the report. A lot of it's already done, but we wanted to really clarify around the role of the Commissioner and so on. And obviously we'd want to get an update, I think, from the Commissioner and their correspondence with the Scottish Government. Is there anything else we need to do at this point? Brian?
Yeah, I think this morning's evidence actually has been really helpful. A number of things fly up for me. One, I have to simply say this out loud. I think the Young People's Commissioner has not covered himself in glory throughout this, and I think he has to consider what role he should be playing in this. I think it was quite interesting. You know, we talked a lot about employment law. We talked the role of HMRC in this, because it's HMRC's role to audit books. You know, we haven't really gone into that, and I think one of the things we should be. I think that what would be interesting to come out, I should say, is those people within the organisation that will be required to be PVG checked from now on. I would like to see that list, because I think that's really important. But I think we can. The Disclosure Scotland bill has passed through stage 1, so we're in a position here where the report that we do here will influence that. I do think we should try and get that report out before that happens. But there's a lot at play here. Employment law, we haven't really dug deep into that, and I think the role of HMRC in this has not been specifically raised either.
I suppose in terms of disclosure, Bill, I'm assuming you'll have made a submission to them, and I think it would be important for us perhaps to reinforce to the Education Committee that we've had this conversation. We think these are really important issues, yeah, rather than waiting. And I do think we want to conclude our report round, and I think these issues really round registration and compensation, the commodification of young people, the rights of young people, which go beyond them being able to complain. And I think we would be looking to yourself and the SFA to recognise that wellbeing role. And obviously, if you've got a report coming, that would be really helpful in that regard. Can I thank you very much for your attendance today? We've run over slightly, but I think you'll appreciate that there are big issues here. If there are, you have made a number of commitments to things you're going to come back to us. We look forward to hearing from you on that. But if there are other issues that you wanted to clarify or confirm, I think we would find that really helpful in our considerations as well.
No problem.
So
Thank you.
Again, thank you very much for your attendance. I'm going to suspend briefly to allow the witnesses to leave the table. can call the meeting back to order. And the next petition on the agenda is petition 1600 on speed awareness courses. The petition was last considered by the committee at its meeting on 10th October 2019. At that meeting, the committee took evidence from Chief Superintendent Gary McEwen, who represented a multi-agency working group convened to devise the necessary infrastructure and guidance to support the introduction of speed awareness courses. The committee subsequently wrote to the Scottish Government for an update on the introduction of speed awareness courses, including the financial implications. The Scottish Government has reaffirmed its commitment to the introduction of speed awareness courses and highlighted that a course content and funding subgroup has been established to consider possible costs appropriately and will consider the funding exercise completed by Police Scotland. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Gail?
Yep, I think that, well, first of all, the petitioner should be very proud of their work because this has resulted in a subgroup and it's taken it to the highest level. I am content that the government are seriously considering this now, and rightly so. I think it's a really important step. So given the feedback from the government and the creation of this funding subgroup that are also looking at course content, which to me, you know, says that they're really, really serious about it, I think that we've probably taken this petition as far as we can. But yeah, really, really great work by petitioner.
I suppose the frustration we've always had with this is something that feels quite straightforward has taken such a long time. But I do think I would probably agree with Gail Ross that there clearly is now progress, that the petitioner has the opportunity to monitor that progress, and of course if there's no further progress in a year's time they could submit another petition, and we'd be very disappointed if that were the case. Yeah. But I think we do recognise that there has been movement on something that should practically make a difference. So I think we're agreeing to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that has been identified that relevant organisations are committed to the introduction of speed awareness courses, pending the operation of financial assessments with various working groups mentioned above. And we would hope that these would be done with a degree of pace rather than being left to lie. And we'd want to thank the petitioner for their engagement with the committee and recognise the progress that's been made. Is that agreed? Agreed. Okay. If we can then move on to the next petition on our agenda, which is petition 1671 on the sale and use of glue traps. The petition, lodged by Lisa Harvey and Andrea Goddard on behalf of Let's Get Mad for Wildlife, is calling on the Scottish Government to ban the sale and use of glue traps and boards in Scotland. The petition was last considered in June 2019 when the committee took evidence from Pest Management Alliance. Since that meeting, the Alliance has provided the committee with a draft copy of its revised Code of Practice. And while I'm sure that members are grateful for the sight of the draft Code of Practice and appreciate the Alliance's willingness to engage with the committee, we don't have the technical expertise to know what the impact of these proposed changes will be, and therefore it's limited in what comment we can make on either the changes or any possible alternatives. The petitioners have provided a submission which details the views of the draft Code of Practice, and this submission is summarised in our meetings paper. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. I personally was quite struck by the very helpful table they provided on the changes, some of which you could see from the perspective of the petitioner were negative changes. The very obvious one, the first one, they identify that there was a removal of the statement that all other options for rodent control must be carefully considered before rodent glue boards were used. And I think, certainly I thought that was a positive thing to put in. So I think there's quite a lot of issues there. I wonder if members have comments on what we might do. Gail?
Yeah, I mean, I have complete sympathy with this petition from an animal welfare point of view, and you would think that if the guidance or the Code of Practice was going to be updated, that it would be updated and it would be nothing but positive changes. And it's really disappointing to hear from the petitioner that, you know, she feels that some of the changes are essentially a backward step. She does say in the submission of the 9th of January, we would like to reiterate a recommendation for the Scottish Government to either adopt a complete ban on the sale and use, or to have licensing of pest control operators and licensing of the glue traps uses. And I think that that's a perfectly reasonable thing to be asking for. I know I have my own personal opinions on this, which are not relevant here, but as to the action that I think we should take as a committee, I think we definitely need to be writing to the Scottish Government to find out what their position is, to respond to the petitioner's recent submission, because I think that, yeah, I'm actually quite concerned about what the petitioner has to say about that.
Okay, is there any other views? Brian?
I mean, I was looking back to see what the Cabinet Secretary had said when we took evidence from him, saying the preferred option was to allow the continued use of glue traps by professional pest controllers, adhering to this code of practice. And I think, as Gail Ross has pointed out, I would actually quite like to understand why in terms of the negative changes, why they were brought in, because it should have only been, I would have thought there was an opportunity here to get to a point where everybody was much closer to an agreement. So I would like to understand why they took those negative changes. Perhaps we could write there. We'd definitely be writing to the government to look at their update on the current position, given the new set of rules that have come out.
I wonder whether it be worth writing to the Pest Management Alliance, saying we recognise that they have engaged, have tried to sort of update their guidance, what has been the thinking around the kind of identification of issues that are there, but yeah, recognise that they have actually engaged at all. So I think we would be agreeing to write to Scottish Government, ask for an update, writing to Pest Management Alliance, but also asking the Scottish Government to respond to the concerns outlined by petitioners. Yep. Is that agreed? Agreed. Okay, in that case, if we could move on. The next petition on our agenda is petition 1674 on the managing the cat population in Scotland, lodged by Ellie Stirling, calling on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to review the Code of Practice under the Wildlife and Natural Environment Scotland Act 2011 and to identify measures which could be introduced to control the soaring domestic cat population and protect the existence of the Scottish wildcat. This petition was last considered on 21st November 2019, and at that meeting the committee took evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform and agreed to reflect on the evidence heard at a future meeting. And obviously we've had further submissions from the petitioner and others. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Brian?
Sorry.
Yes, I know that the government are taking quite significant action around trying to keep stable populations of the Scottish wildcat going. So quite pleased to see Scottish Government taking some positive action here. I'm just wondering what we can do further to that, or that this Petitions Committee can do further to that. And I'm not quite sure. I think the petitioner has obviously raised very significant issues that, you know, say every day's a school day in here that I was unaware of. And to the petitioner's credit, has had a pretty positive response from the Scottish Government. So in terms of this Petitions Committee, I'm not sure that what we can do further, but I do recognise the significant movement this petition has delivered.
Gail?
Yeah, sorry, excuse me. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Petitioner is hugely passionate about this, and she has done such a lot of work and has to be absolutely commended. And I get everything that she's saying, but as Brian said, as a petitions committee, we've already had the evidence from the Cabinet Secretary that they are not going to move on this. The government are not going to introduce it as a legislative measure. And we also heard, you know, about the work that is ongoing with Scottish Wildcat Action, and indeed there's been announcements since, I believe, about release and their breeding programme. So whilst I can completely sympathise with the intentions, I think as a committee that possibly we're not going to be able to take it any further, unfortunately.
I think,
Morris?
yes, I'd agree. I think the issue comes around empirical evidence, and it's the sort of convincing the government being convinced that you know, that we should provide push it any further. But obviously, I'm concerned about the petitioner's comment about the thought that, you know, could potentially result in 4 million new cats per year. But then again, we have to base some decisions on evidence, on the empirical formula. And I know this is in other areas of life, but I think at this stage it's being monitored by the Scottish Government. I think we should move on, and I do propose that we close the petition at this stage.
I think it would be fair to say that in the evidence we heard from the Scottish Government, they are aware of these issues, and there is work ongoing. And obviously in terms of the petition, if the petition is closed and they feel there has been no progress or it's counterproductive, they could bring back the petition in a year's time. But my sense is that in terms of the specific proposal that's been put forward by the petitioner, there's a recognition of the issues, but the Scottish Government is pretty fixed on what they're doing at the moment. So I think my sense is we are agreeing to close the petition on that basis. But I wonder whether it would be worthwhile, in closing the petition, we simply flag up to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee. There's a body of work here that they may want to draw on at a later stage if this is something that they're looking at. So all that, you know, the work and the submissions that have been provided us, we could pass them on. We're not saying that they should deal with the petition, but we think that that body of work that's there may inform their work at a later stage. Would that be agreed? Agreed. Okay, in that case, can we thank the petitioner for all of the work that's been done in this and recognise the importance of the area that's been highlighted. If we can then move on to the next petition for consideration, which is petition 1709 on install CCTV cameras and provide full-time social work support in all additional support needs schools, lodged by Claire Mooney, which calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to install CCTV cameras and establish full-time social work presence in all additional support needs schools in Scotland. The petition was last considered on the 20th of June 2019 when we discussed concerns raised in written evidence in relation to the action called for in the petition. This includes possible infringements of human rights relating to privacy, as well as general data protection regulations implications. Since that meeting, submissions have been received from COSLA and the petitioner. In their submission, COSLA note that they have a number of initial concerns about the proposal for CCTV cameras, either fixed or mounted, including body cameras. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action.
Can I come in? Yeah, I put a question to the Cabinet Secretary of Education a couple of weeks ago, and to which he responded that, as it happened just a few days before we spoke in the chamber, that there has been a report prepared by the Cabinet Secretary on this very subject. And the response I got from him satisfied me that things had been taken into hand on that. And I think we need to just see the outcome of that and implementations, that being implemented. So I think the government have moved to do something about this. And therefore I would propose that we would close the petition.
Brian?
I was actually really struck by what Unison had to say around, rather than the CCTV, you know, there should be investment in staff who can identify people's additional support needs, and that is a very compelling statement for me. That whole around, you know, funding requirement for staff training and ongoing professional development is to me, if I had to invest in one or the other, I would most definitely.
On that very point, and that was part of my question, and part of the answer was addressed by the Cabinet Secretary. It wasn't just simply, you know,
What I would say, what the petitioner has done is actually made us and the government consider this particular issue. And the fact is that you know, it might not be the answer that the petitioner is looking for, but you know, they should be again commended for the movement in terms of this committee and the government in recognising that it's an issue and that actual action will be taken. As I said, I'm really struck with the fact that, you know, if I was going to give one or the other, I would invest in staff training and staff development in that respect, obviously. But as I said, the unison one was the one that struck me the most.
Gail?
Yeah, I mean, I think in other considerations that we've had in the evidence that the Cabinet Secretary gave about the restraint and seclusion aspect of it, and we've got that commitment from the government that that's going to be updated. We've got a time scale, you know. I think that that was very compelling and also feeds into this as well, and what Maurice was saying about, you know, the commitment that he got in chamber through that question.
Mm-hmm. I think it does fit in with the petition on restraint. I think that's important because there is an issue about how young people are being treated and what is good practice. I'm not sure if it would always be a social worker that you would want, but you would want qualified staff and sufficient staff, and I think that comes out of the submissions from the unions, that there's an issue here about actually the extent to which schools are properly staffed with the level of support staff that they require. And I know this is something the Education Committee is very alive to and has looked at this in some detail, what additional support needs, how young people with additional support needs are properly supported and kept safe. And so I don't think it's something that's going to disappear. I think it's very much an issue that people are aware of. And yeah, in fact, the restraint petition has gone to the Education Committee. So perhaps we could follow up. If we're agreeing to close the petition, we could simply follow up and say to them, this is further evidence that it's clearly an area that people are concerned about, and it's expressing itself in different ways, that while we don't necessarily agree with the solution it's called for in the petition, or we don't think there's support for it, there is no doubt there's a recognition that what has prompted it is very serious. Absolutely. And we would hope the Education Committee would reflect on that. Would that be agreed then? Yep, agreed. So we're agreeing to close the petition as has been indicated. Again, we'd want to thank the petitioner very much for the work they've done to bring this to the attention of the committee, and we will ensure that the Education Committee is informed of that work. So if we can move on now to the next agenda item, which is consideration of new petitions. The next item on our agenda is consideration of a number of new petitions. The first new petition for consideration today is petition 1766 on legal aid for private criminal prosecutions for unwaged and or learning disabled victims of abuse, lodged by Andrew Buchan, calling the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to change the law to provide free legal aid to people who are unwaged and or learning disabled victims of abuse who wish to bring a private criminal prosecution. Our briefing explains the background to legal aid, including financial eligibility and public and private prosecutions. In a written submission, the petitioner advises that the intention of the petition is to make legal aid for private criminal prosecutions standard without having to meet any criteria other than a crime or crimes that have been committed. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action.
I think that probably at this early stage we need to be writing to the Scottish Government just to get the views on where the petition stands in the whole legal system. I know that dealing with legal aid for constituents, that sometimes it can be seen as being quite complicated. So I think that just to get an overview on what the situation is at the moment would then inform our thinking going forward.
And I suppose in a way the petition almost begs the question. It says there should be legal aid where crimes have been committed, but of course the test for legal aid is about the likelihood of securing a prosecution, and if it's not deemed to be prosecutable, I don't know whether we then make a distinction in a private prosecution. So I think there are interesting issues here. There's more general issues about access to justice, what appears to be a very, very limited role for private prosecutions at the moment. but how that actually sits for the Scottish Government, what their view of that is, and what's prompted the petition round access to legal aid, maybe a broader question about the context of private prosecutions themselves, and of course people feeling that the prosecution service doesn't necessarily recognise sufficiently where a crime has been committed, or people are very often disappointed that perhaps their case has not been pursued. Is there anything else we can do apart from writing to the Scottish Government? I think that's probably reasonable to start with. Yeah. Okay, in that case, we agree to do that. And if we can move on to the second new petition for consideration today, which is petition 1768 on children hearing proceedings, should be minuted and or recorded, lodged by James Mackey, calling the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to ensure that all proceedings in the children's hearing are minuted or recorded. Our briefing provides background on the children's hearing system and the legislative framework it operates under. The Children's Hearing Scotland Act 2011, Rules of Procedure in Children's Hearings, Rules 2013 rules, provides for how children's hearings are run in more detail. The 2013 rules set out duties for both the chair of the panel and the reporter. In terms of the chair, Rule 6C states that the chair must ensure that a record is made of the decisions or determinations made by the children's hearing or pre-hearing panel, as the case may be, then the reason for those decisions or determinations, and sign and date the record of the decisions or determinations. Rule 13 provides for duties on the reporter in terms of record keeping at a hearing. These records are in relation to the location, time and date of the hearing, details of the child and any other attendees, and details of the decision and any directions made. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Gail?
Yes, again, new petition. I think lots of questions within it. Again, I think we should just be writing to the government in the first instance to find out, because there's obviously reasons for the way that the system is set up at the moment, and it would be good to get that feedback as to why the system is the way it is.
Okay. Brian?
One of the interesting things that came out was the fact that neither the children nor the parents are involved in these discussions, which, on the face of it, given my limited knowledge of these matters, was something I would certainly like to understand a little bit better. So I would quite like to write to the Children's Hearing Improvement Partnership just on that particular point, just asking from their perspective why they don't involve parents and children in those discussions.
But parents and children are involved in the panel discussions.
Yeah.
So I'm not. I suppose my instinct is, and I suppose this is what we would want to explore. In my own experience of the hearing system, one of its strengths is the opportunity to have a frank and open conversation about the issues that are facing a young person. Whether then recording everything anybody says inhibits that conversation. I mean, the Education Committee in recent times did a review of the hearing system and looked at what its strengths were and whether it was appropriately funded and so on. I'm sure people can access that report. But my concern would be, and there was already a concern flagged up, that already the scale of legal representation at a hearing is far greater than ever was in the past. It's more formalised than perhaps it would have been back in the day, certainly when I attended, and yet its core strength remains that ability to talk with the young person themselves and with their family and relevant people about what is happening and how they can be supported. So I think it would be worthwhile asking the question whether, what the government's views on this, what the view of the CHIP is on it. But I suppose the question we would have to satisfy ourselves on, are we unnecessarily formalising something which actually has huge strengths in terms of the welfare of the young person?
I agree. What I was suggesting was that the fact that I would like to formally hear why that's not the case, because I'm quite sure they'll come up with very legitimate reasons, as very similar to what you just said there, but it's not an area of expertise that I would particularly.
Okay. Yeah. Is that agreed then, that we will write in those terms both to Scottish Government and to CHIP? I agree. Okay, if we can then move on to the next new petition, which is petition 1769, asking the Scottish Government to review the way higher education in Scotland is set up and delivered in Scotland, including how student rights are enforced and whether there is scope to allocate more power to the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman. Our briefing explains the background to and organisation of quality standards in teaching and the various Scottish Government initiatives in this area. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Brian?
Thank you. And on the face of this, I think the Education Committee have done a reasonable amount of work within this here, and it's. I think we'll obviously take this forward, but I think ultimately this is going to end up in another committee, in my view. I certainly think we should be writing to the Scottish Government, obviously, to seek their actions in a petition, given it's a new petition, and there are a variety of stakeholders. I'm quite sure we could seek their views on in terms of the action called for in a petition. But I'm back to this. I think ultimately this will move on to another committee.
Question then that we should be doing, we should be accepting that. This is a very fundamental thing about standards in higher education, yep, and how those are quality assured and so on. There's a different issue about access and so on, but it's very much about enforcing the rights of students and also maintaining the quality that's delivered. Are young people being taught in bigger classes? Are they being get less access time, less time in seminars or whatever it might be? I guess the question is whether, it's clearly a big issue, it's a question of whether we should be asking the Education Committee to look at it rather than ourselves, in the context of what they're doing around standards. And indeed, of course, the Scottish Parliament has debated some of these issues already.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Absolutely. Can I just add a point, Chair? Mm-hmm. One of the things I'm concerned about, and it highlighted itself through my readings, of the learning support at that level, is something I'd like to be also added in under the quality assurance, so learning support in higher education. I know there's an issue there. So,
I think there's certainly an issue around access, sort of the kind of student support. I mean, it's certainly been said to me that the level of student support in terms of how they're coping yeah, is less visible in higher education than in further education, and therefore that might impact on sort of dropout rates and so on. I wonder whether, in order to just, as a starter for 10, we do write to Scottish Government as key stakeholders, and once we've got that view, with a view to maybe sort of flagging up to the Education Committee as something they might take forward. Yeah. So at least we've got that first wee bit of work done.
Background, yeah.
That's why I raised the question, because I think it's important that we probably do that first, yeah, and highlight some of these points that might well come out. Yeah.
For me, conveners, it's quite a very open-ended ask here. I was looking through this idea of public confidence and the quality of student experience. And if you came to me, I would be going down a certain route with that. I'm quite sure that's probably a different route than other people would go. So it's quite an open-ended petition here. But I think you're right. I think we do need to make the initial inquiry and then decide whether or not we take it further and move it on to the Education Committee, because I'm pretty sure that's where this is going to end up.
I mean, certainly the Education Committee looked before, and there were some representations to us about the impact of the Teaching Excellence and Student Outcomes Framework, which was led by the Office for Students in England, which is connected to your capacity then to charge tuition fees, which is not a regime is operating in Scotland, but the question then is what is actually happening in higher education in Scotland in terms of the amount of money is invested by the Scottish Government. Does that match actually the level of tuition that young people need and so on? But that's maybe taken in a slightly different direction. But I think maybe what we agree to do is to write to stakeholders, get a response. But we are very alive to the fact that these are huge issues, as you say, and it may be more properly dealt with in the longer term by the Education Committee. That's agreed. We can move on. Our next new petition is Petition 1772, Ban Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender Teaching and Sexual Pictures from the School Curriculum, lodged by Pamela Suarez, which is calling on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to ban lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender teaching and sexual pictures in curriculum of secondary and primary schools. The petition argues that the presence of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender teaching and sexual pictures in the curriculum of secondary and primary schools, due to its cultivation of a new ideology of gender, is dangerous in education and formation to girls and boys. The petition also states that the government is going against the moral value taught in the child's home by violating human and parental rights. Our briefing states that the Scottish Government announced in November 2018 that Scotland would be the first country in the world to have LGBTI inclusive education embedded in the curriculum, and accepted in full the recommendations of the LGBTI Inclusive Education Working Group. These 33 recommendations, which cover the professional learning of teachers, practice and guidance, school inspections and anti-bullying, are to be delivered before the end of the current parliamentary term in March 2021. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action.
Yes, several. I think that there are various aspects of this petition that are simply incorrect. There is no promotion of homosexuality in our schools. It is a learning system that allows young people to see themselves reflected in the education that they get. And we know that from the work that the Thai campaign have done, we were very successful in bringing the change about, that this helps children in their learning and attainment, it builds their confidence, and they don't feel that they are alone. And it mentions in our papers the Equalities and Human Rights Committee's report on bullying, and I was part of the committee when we took that piece of work through, and some of the evidence that came forward from the young people about prejudice-based bullying was very, very distressing. And I think that any attempt to roll back these rights and education standards is a massive step backwards. I mean, it's 20 years since we repealed Section 28. There's cross-party agreement for the continuation of the LGBTI education in schools, and rightly so. And I would very strongly suggest that we close this petition, because there is no appetite for what the petitioner is calling on.
Other views? David?
Can I agree with Gail there? The Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament should be really proud of its equalities, genders and what we've achieved to do with equalities. And I think there's no place for this petition, and the Scottish Government have already committed to putting LGBTI education inclusively into curriculum. So I'm happy to close the petition.
Not much to add really. I think the reality is the Scottish Government and this Parliament is committed to ensuring LGBTI rights, in fact, the rights of any part of society. No matter what we decide to do here, that the Scottish Government are not going to move. They're very committed to that, as is this Parliament. So it'll be very difficult to see where this petition can possibly go. I mean, you know, I've got to say, I do think we should be closing the petition, because even if we write to the Scottish Government, pretty sure we'll be closing the petition straight after that, because there'll be no commitment from the Scottish Government to do anything other than they are currently doing. So I have to agree with my colleagues that the only way forward with this petition is to close it.
My sense is it misrepresents what sex education in schools is, that it's not advocacy, it's about understanding relationships. It's also about it being age appropriate, that children at different stages will learn about different things, but also at the heart of it is issues of consent and respect and dignity, and that applies no matter what someone's sexual orientation is, I think. So I think it misrepresents, in my view, what's happening in our schools, and that there are, you know, there is an ongoing conversation about what that education looks like at every stage, and I know that parents can be very much engaged with that, but probably where the argument lies is, do we seriously think that, well, first of all, should there be sex education in schools? I think, and relationship education, my view is yes, there should be, and if there is, then it needs to understand where our young people are, what their families are coming from, and so on, and some of the complexities of relationships, and that can only help our young people rather than be something to be fearful of. So my sense is the committee is accepting they want to close this petition, not because they don't think there's a conversation to be had about how sex education is taught in our schools, but that because it misrepresents that, and the idea 20 years on from getting rid of Section 2A, Section 28, that the concern would be specifically around education LGBTI issues, I think is something that the Parliament has already taken a view on. And I think across the Parliament a very strong commitment to equality in that regard. So I think we're going to agree to close the petition. On the basis the Scottish Government has committed to have LGBTI inclusive education embedded in the curriculum, and that has been with the support of the Parliament. And we'd want to thank the petitioner for bringing the petition to the attention of the committee, and of course in a year's time they have the right to resubmit a petition if they so chose. Our next new petition is Petition 1773, Reform Rape Law, lodged by Sarah Takahanshini, which calls the Scottish Government to update the Sexual Offences Scotland Act 2009 to include the offence of a man being raped by a woman. Our briefing note explains that the Sexual Offences Scotland Act 2009 created a statutory offence of rape, replacing the previous common law offence. Although the Act broadened the definition of rape, a woman who rapes a man could still not be charged with rape. The petitioner argues this is unfair and seeks a change in the law to resolve this iniquity. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Brian?
Well, I didn't know it wasn't rape, to be quite honest. So it was a bit of a surprise to me when I read that. I think there are, you know, when we look at this, there'll be a prejudice around this, around the different connotations of a woman being raped by a man than a man being raped by a woman, I would have thought, because this perception of a man being able to defend himself. So, I think
it's more to do with the definition of rape, and I think that's what, in my view, sexual assault of other kinds is captured in law as it is, but it's about the fundamental definition of what rape is, which can only be done by a man.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think I'd like to find out what the Scottish Government's view on this, and there'll be other stakeholders, certainly around Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal and Law Society of Scotland, Rape Crisis Scotland, just get their views on it. I didn't actually know.
In legal terms, it's actually not been that long since there was a very fundamental review of rape, and at that time I'm sure these issues must have been considered, but I think it'd be worthwhile at least getting views on that. If that's agreed.
Yes, great.
Okay, in that case, if we can move on to the final new petition for consideration today, which is Petition 1777, calling for the Scottish Government to introduce the British Sign Language, BSL, into the Curriculum for Excellence. Our briefing explains that very little of the school curriculum is statutory, although local authorities have a statutory duty to secure an adequate and efficient education for children of school age. Beyond that, young people are largely able to choose which qualifications they wish to take. The SQA offers a number of qualifications on BSL. The British Sign Language Scotland Act 2015 provides for a duty on the Scottish Government to quote, promote and facilitate the promotion of, the use and understanding of BSL. Local authorities must also produce BSL plans, which set out what they will be doing in relation to the use of BSL. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Morris.
Seek the Scottish Government's and Education Scotland, for example, views on this, because I think it's something that it comes back to my point about learning support, and I think it's important this should be looked at.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I've, notwithstanding the petition here, but I've heard of this push to get it included in the curriculum from a number of different sides, and I think that it would be interesting to hear what the Scottish Government and Education Scotland's position is on it. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, this is an issue that's featured in the Parliament from its beginning, down to training of teachers way back in the day, and there was a lot of campaigning, very effective campaigning, and of course we have the legislation. I've also been in conversation with young people who use BSL, and one of their issues is the capacity of BSL teachers to operate at the level that's appropriate to their level of learning. So it's not the basic stuff, but if you're trying to learn advanced higher physics, then the skill level for signing is much higher, and I think it's something that should be embedded more in the system. It's such a basic thing that we should be able to communicate as young people with other young people, and I think it's very much goes with the flow of what we regard as inclusive education. So I think it would be interesting to write Scottish Government and Education Scotland, and of course, in terms of those who may have an interest, who may be aware of this petition, we've obviously interest to hear from them as well. I don't have to write to them, but I think it'd be something that some of these organisations may wish to respond to how they think that would look like in our schools and their capacity of schools to deliver on it. So if we can agree that, I think there's some positive action we can take on that. Good. And with that, we have come to the end of our agenda today, and I want to thank everyone for their attendance, and I'll close the meeting.